Hi, everybody. I wanted to take some time today and go over the beginning of the white paper that we're using for this semester's work, Arts, Health, and Well-Being in America, commissioned by the National Organization for Arts and Health. So, broad strokes, the idea of a white paper, thought I'd include a definition as a noun. And essentially, it's a sponsored report for a complex issue. And as the definition implies, it's from an authoritative group and they're giving information about a specific subject. And in this regard, if the white paper is about arts and health in America. And we'll begin at the beginning with the letter from the current president, Todd Frazier. And notice that he's talking about the organization of NOAA being part of a continuum. So it isn't just emerging out of nowhere, but in fact, there were previous arts and health organizations, and he names them. And we give credit for the current NOAA board benefiting from all of the previous board members um, and membership groups that moved the field forward. It's also talking about art as a major tool for um, bridging organizations, providing innovative ways to communicate, and then specifically talking about the white paper as an overview that includes design as it applies to healthcare environments, how the arts and the humanities can help in training medical professionals, the use in different populations, different ways that the arts can respond to crisis or trauma in our country and elsewhere as a way to understand our differences. And then also he's mentioning that this is a living document, which means in an emerging field, um, this is the best current practice, but it's an evolving field. And so it's a check-in for the day, but it isn't a completely definitive look. I hope it's helpful to unpack this. It's it's pretty straightforward writing, but it's some complicated issues. And many of you who've taken the time to read the section that was assigned will notice that there's repetition and there's specific phrases being used. And anytime something is repeated, it just helps us learn. And then when our ears pick up certain phrasing, some of that is going to be useful when we talk about the work that's being done. So it's specific in that manner. So in the executive summary, they start us off by uh, making sure we understand that the arts, although it can often be mainly about the visual arts, it includes dance and theater, literature, um, architecture, interior design. I've even heard the list to include contemplative arts, which is the guided imagery and visualization and memorization and prayer. So it's an extensive, broad term when they talk about the arts. And it's a way to enhance and promote public health and overall support the well-being of our citizens. There's a lot of examples of where you can find it, and a lot of people that practice it. And we're going to look at the specifics, but in the executive summary, you're getting another review of what's coming and what the big picture is. And the idea is that depending on the location and the person that practices arts and health, we're improving clinical, experiential, and sort of holistic or whole person outcomes. Through the writing of the paper, we will see an introduction to programs and the professionals that work there, and then the consumers of arts and health. And they've got it organized within 6 domains of practice, and therefore 6 sections, which we're reading, sequentially through this semester. So in addition to those 6 domains of practice, we will also see recommendations in the white paper for national structure for the practitioners of arts and health, reviewing of research, and then the third part, developing national standards, so that as more and more people come into this field, there's a codification, I think is the word, when things become measurable, and therefore we can communicate the high levels of work and standards. That's what it says. So now we're into the introduction, and essentially we are saying that there's a broad range of arts, and remember there were a lot of different categories, and they're applied to people across the whole life spectrum, so from birth to end of life. And there isn't an international standard, but there are programs that we look to, certainly in Australia and England and Canada. There are different levels of arts and health applied to their communities. And so the United States is informed by what's going on with our neighbors. But when we talk about health, we can look to the World Health Organization to define it, which is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmary. And when you talk about physical, mental, and social well-being, then there's room, for the arts, that we're just not about medicine, and health isn't just about healing what's wrong, but also providing an environment that supports good health and wellness. So that's a definition that you'll need to know, and I'm sure I'll include it on one of the quizzes or assignments. Now in the United States, there's a multidisciplinary approach, meaning that a great range of the arts are included, and again across the whole life spectrum, whole life care in terms of age, for the prevention of illness. I'm completely annoyed by one of these by one of these quotes in there, but in the section called Evolution of Creative Art Therapies in Arts and Health, there's just this slight nod that creativity is part of the human experience since the dawn of man. And then we jump right into the Workman's, the WPA. Workers Project Association. I'd have to look that up. In the 1930s, which is basically when our government stepped in with the WPA and created jobs for the creative types. And I guess I'm old enough that some of my teachers were either part of that WPA, like I said the first time we met. Jacob Lawrence was my drawing teacher at the University of Washington. And I suppose that's an extra credit if you look up his work and become familiar with him. But what the government was doing was putting everybody back to work, and one section of that was the creatives. And so there were murals commissioned. We still have post offices around our country that had murals that were created by local artists. Art teachers and classes were put back to work through government funding, and even what is the word? Commissioned pieces in healthcare or hospital environments were part of that. If you've heard of the painter Jackson Pollock, he was also on the tail end of the WPA project and one of the muralists. And then, as far as the broad strokes of the application of arts in healing environments, they're looking at the World War II. I also know that through research that they were applying art making for returning soldiers from World War I as a way to rehabilitate soldiers that were injured, with the arts and crafts, and certainly by World War II as well. Then the next distinction to talk about is the creative art therapists, or CATs, and they've been around as individual groups for 60 plus years. I believe that it was the American Music Therapy Association that was the first. And one of the things to keep in mind about the creative arts therapies is that they are focused on a specific discipline or medium. So the American Art Therapy Association, they're talking about the visual arts and using those in conjunction with therapeutic practices to support wellness. And then the dance and music. And there's also a society for American Society for Group Psychotherapy and Psychodrama. Oh, I should have numbered all of them, or I thought I did, because there are these 6 associations or groups that make up the creative art therapies, that sort of umbrella clause that these individual associations are a part of, and they're the most established in terms of practices, in terms of research, and it makes for very powerful programming and advocating for the work that they do. The next generation, they talk about, are the expressive arts therapists. Well, I'll get to that on the next slide. So even though we had the CATs coming up in the 60s, it wasn't until the end of the 1979 before the National Coalition of Creative Art Therapies, which is their membership organization that combined, that umbrella of these 6 different associations. 79 before that was created. So like I was saying, the next generation of art therapists were EATS, or expressive arts therapy. And starting in the 1970s, essentially that next generation started to pull in the practices of two or more modalities or medium. So they might use visual arts in conjunction with drama, or they might use music along with uh, storytelling, for example. So expressive is just the use of two or more different mediums in their therapy work. And then in the late or the mid 90s, 1994, this International Expressive Arts Therapy Association was developed. And the primary driving force of expressive arts therapies is Lesley University out in Boston, and still going strong with their program. So when I was mentioning that letter from the NOAA's current president, he was giving a nod to previous arts and health organizations, and we can look at the Society of Arts and Healthcare Administration back in the late 1980s, and then Global Alliance for Arts and Health that followed it, and now currently NOAA is the the nation's organization. So if you weren't a therapist and a cat or an EAT, then you were collaborating. And that's that narrow spectrum that's separate from art therapists. And I suppose that I'm most passionate about that because I fit in the category of a professional creative type who also sees the value in bringing it to therapeutic environments. And so there's not as, organized in the past. Instead, it came from collaborations with caregivers, medical professionals, art consultants, artists, art administration. And not to say it wasn't organized per facility, it just meant that these are decisions and projects that were a case-by-case basis rather than sort of a national standard or even a state standard. And it's really all about humanizing this experience that people have when they have vulnerable health and they go to medical professionals for service. So when you look at the continuum of care, in this class, we keep the cats and the EATs separate. We talk about them in terms of their roles, but to become an art therapist, that's in conjunction with a mental health counseling degree, and I'm very interested in advocating for the creative freedom and room for arts and health types, which the good news is we can fill in a lot of the gaps that therapists might not have the time or the resources to meet. So in arts and health, we can manage and facilitate art experiences. We can enhance workplace environments. And another emphasis is to reduce caregiver stress. Those are the big ones that we talk about. Overall, how do arts support health? We're saying it. Humanizing or enhancing what happens when you interact with the buildings and the staff to get your treatment. The arts can also promote public health issues. They're a great way to share information and educate communities through the arts in conjunction with medical professionals. And again, to say it another way, rather than care for caregivers, the arts in terms of participation or in terms of being an audience member would foster resilience or fortify medical professionals. Limited but complements the research of cats and meats. Oh, research in the area of arts, health, and well-being. Because this is an emerging field, we don't have the body of research that the therapies who have been investigating and practicing for many, many more decades, but they complement the approach. And that means that arts and health can still have program evaluations and surveys and case studies, which we're going to be hearing from a guest lecturer about a case study involving her family, where we can track the experience of a single participant. There's observations that are made when someone watches another person be a part of an art session or music making, and as well as interview studies. So this is a general list of the kinds of research approaches that you might see with the therapies, but they certainly can be utilized in arts and health. Ultimately, the punchline of what's going on with research is that anymore in healthcare, you must have evidence-based decisions. So it is critical that we use some of the best practices of our sort of therapeutic cousins in order to communicate the value of our arts programming, because that's the way healthcare is run. And we won't reinvent the wheel. We'll complement the way they do business and they serve their customers. So here's something that I wanted you to pay attention to, I guess, enough that we're going to have a discussion about the 5 areas of focus, which are pretty well defined in the white paper: healthcare environments, patient care, care for caregivers, health science education, and community health and well-being. And we'll have an opportunity to continue to look at examples of each of these, what's currently going on nationally. And although they're not pictures in this PowerPoint or even in the future ones, once we start looking at existing programs and projects, there's a certain liveliness about it, because it's all about patient interaction and wonderful creative events for our senses. So be encouraged that although this is a pretty straightforward PowerPoint, the nature of the work is quite exciting. That's enough to get us started. And the discussion is going to ask you specifically about the areas of focus and a follow-up. So thanks for listening. Let's do this again next week.